David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Later on the show today, I'm going to tell you that I believe the left is losing the so-called battle of ideas. But before we can even have that conversation, we should go over the details of the multiple mass shootings that took place this weekend with countless casualties carried out once again by people, at least in one case, inspired by the ideology that underlies support for Donald Trump and which, in fact, Donald Trump himself has been fomenting. And then also a mass shooting carried out by an apparent pro-LGBT rights, anti-Trump leftist. So yes, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. One of the shooting incidents this weekend was by an apparent leftist, but we will talk about the degree to which we can say their ideology inspired the actual violence. This is a really important thing to understand. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take it piece by piece. Let's go through the sick details. Now, before we even do that, just to be clear, it's a foregone conclusion that all of today's show is going to be demonetized for us on YouTube and other platforms because these are the stories that are not considered brand safe. So we're going to earn no money on most of today's stories because we're covering what took place over the weekend. So consider leaving a tip, so to speak. Become a member at joinpakman.com because everything we're talking about today, even tangentially related to these shootings, is going to be demonetized. So let's start with El Paso. Donald Trump has been doing everything from threatening Sweden to release A$AP Rocky, an American rapper, to encouraging violence at his rallies by saying he'll pay the legal fees of people who get arrested for roughing up protesters. He's repeated the xenophobic language about immigrants, particularly brown-skinned ones of all types from S-hole countries, in contrast to people from Norway, who are the people we should want coming to the United States. And it is all now coming to a head with a weekend that includes a mass shooting where at least one shooter specifically claimed that ideology as his inspiration. The first shooting, 11 a.m. on Saturday. Shooter walks into El Paso, Texas Walmart, starts shooting. Around 20 killed, a ton injured. We're still trying to figure out the exact numbers. A 4-month-old baby was killed. The suspect was captured and not killed in this particular case. We have both a post from the shooter on 8chan, an online hub for extremism and racism and white supremacy, and we have the shooter's manifesto. And I know you probably are not surprised to hear this, but it was yet another one of these anti-immigrant radicals who was pushed towards white supremacy, wrote that he agrees with the Christchurch shooter's manifesto, another anti-immigrant xenophobic screed. The manifesto is essentially an amalgamation of the exact xenophobic ideas that have been pushed by Donald Trump and the people around him. A Hispanic invasion of the U.S. and of Texas is something we need to be afraid of. White people are being replaced by foreigners, the great replacement theory or idea or conspiracy theory. The shooter didn't like race mixing, and it said, the manifesto, about immigrants that, quote, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can be more sustainable. It says he was inspired by the same white supremacist anti-immigrant ideology that the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter was inspired by. And the El Paso shooter actually mentioned the Christchurch shooter in the manifesto. News organizations have identified a Twitter account since taken down, appearing to be the suspects, which includes the build the wall hashtag stuff, a picture using guns to spell out the word Trump, as well as posts from a right-wing conspiracy theorist who happens not to like me, named Paul Joseph Watson, known for his association with Alex Jones. So in some cases, these domestic terrorists, and that's what they are, and that's what we should call them, if we care about facts and feelings, that is, sometimes these domestic terrorists literally have a vehicle covered in Trump stuff, like that MAGA bomber who sent pipe bombs to Democrats. Sometimes it's simply the endpoint of stochastic terrorism and radicalization that starts with sometimes as high as the president of the United States and the White House and the rhetoric that we see there. Now, there's a very specific element from the manifesto that Trumpists are pointing to in order to defend Trump, which is that the shooter says his ideas predate Donald Trump. Trump didn't give him these ideas. And this is super interesting. They say, the Trumpists say, this vindicates Donald Trump. This is not a vindication of Trump. This is an indictment of Trump. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I've said all along, Donald Trump hasn't so much radicalized people. He's emboldened and coalesced and inspired the radicals to become more active, to be more public, and to take action around this ideology. This El Paso shooter, just like many others, already held most of these anti-immigrant, xenophobic, Hispanic invasion, great replacement ideas before Donald Trump. What Donald Trump's presidency did is, number one, gave them solidarity. As Richard Spencer told me himself, this is a president that is as close to what they want as they are getting, and who is saying this is the time to do your stuff if there was any time to do it. So number one, Trump gave them solidarity. And number two, Trump made them much more willing to go public with their ideas. And then third, Trump escalated their fear that this stuff was happening and ultimately has inspired them to take action through that mechanism called stochastic terrorism that I've talked about before. The argument for me was never that Trump is radicalizing people who otherwise didn't hold any of these beliefs. It's that Trump has created an environment where the radicals become much more willing to do things in the real world. And we're seeing it every week, month. I mean, I don't know. It depends how you want to categorize it. They're not creating the radicals. They're turning the radicals into actual domestic terrorists by emboldening them and legitimizing their hate ideologies. Now, 13 hours later, in Dayton, Ohio, another mass shooting. Again, we're still getting numbers. Seems like 9 or 10 people killed, around 25 injured. Those numbers may increase in a nightclub by someone that we now believe to be a leftist politically. This suspect was killed by police. The suspect was using a .223 high-capacity gun, had additional magazines with him, was wearing body armor. And in this one, media is making a big deal of how heroic police killed the shooter so quickly, like within a minute or a couple of minutes. Now, that might sound like a win. They're touting that as a win. And of course, it's good to stop someone who is actively trying to kill people before they kill more people. But consider that what this means is that in just 1 minute, the shooter was able to kill 9 people and injure 26, or whatever the exact numbers are. The shooter never should have had firearms that would have let him kill 9 people and injure 26 in 1 minute. That's what we need to be understanding when we hear about the police neutralized him after a minute. Since the shooting, it's been reported that the shooter described himself on social media as he, him, anime fan, metalhead, leftist. I'm going to hell and I'm not coming back. He tweeted that he would vote for Elizabeth Warren in 2020. He tweeted that he was upset about Trump winning in 2016. He said, quote, "I want socialism and I'll not wait for the idiots to finally come around to understanding." He is believed to have been a registered Democrat and has tweeted in favor of gun control and gun safety regulations. Okay, so let's now go through something really important. Here we have a right-wing shooter and a left-wing shooter. And there are elements of the right that, even though we know that the overwhelming majority of political violence is right-wing, they are seizing on this weekend of a right-wing shooter and a left-wing shooter and trying to equate and say, we just have violence from both sides and it's bad and let's work together. I want to be really careful here, but there's a really important distinction that has to be made. Right now, it is abundantly clear that the motivation of the right-wing shooter in El Paso was his right-wing beliefs. Specifically, he left a manifesto. He went to a particular place that is at the center of this battle around the issues around which he was radicalized: immigration and Hispanic people, etc. An anti-immigrant guy worried about a white invasion drives hours to El Paso to do this and leaves a manifesto telling us what radicalized him. We simply don't know whether left-wing beliefs actually inspired the Dayton, Ohio shooter. There is currently no evidence of that. So believe me, this is not a show where I sugarcoat stuff. If we have terrorism from Muslim radicalization, I tell you that. When we have terrorism from these militia types, I tell you that. What we know now is that the Dayton shooter appears to have had leftist politics. We have no evidence that those beliefs are what inspired the shooting. We have no evidence at this point that that political orientation was the reason for the shooting in Dayton, Ohio. As soon as we get that evidence, if we do, I will be right here telling you, but that is not the information that we currently have as of this taping. And it is really important that we not allow the rightists to say these shootings are equivalent in that you had right-wing beliefs inspire a shooting and left-wing beliefs inspire a shooting. Unless we know that the Dayton, Ohio shooting was politically motivated violence, we should not say that it was, and some already are. So that now this is going to get us to, I believe it is time for the left to realize that we are losing the battle of ideas in a very disturbing and specific way. To talk to people about this in a serious way, we have to address this issue. We talk jokingly or satirically about the marketplace of ideas and the battle of ideas, but there is a really concerning and specific way in which we are losing the battle of ideas, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, today's new members of the day are Wilfredo Gonzalez and Brian Kruk. Wilfredo and Brian, thank you. I really appreciate your support. This has been a crazy couple of months for the show. And thanks to record-setting new member numbers in June and July, and already off to a great start in August, we're actually holding steady, and I really appreciate your support. Also want to say thank you to Keith Betancourt, who has been a member for almost 5 years. Keith is today's sustaining member of the day. Please join them. It takes under a minute to become a member at www.joinpakman.com. Also, make sure that if you have an Amazon Prime membership that you have subscribed free to you, but we get paid with Twitch Prime at twitch.tv/David Pakman. Costs you nothing, but we make some money off of that. That's a really great thing. So now comes the difficult part for the left to admit, and quite frankly, the sad part. And I'll get to the conclusion up front so you know what we're talking about. We are losing the battle of ideas. The left is losing the battle of ideas in the United States right now. And it is not because our ideas aren't good. Many of the ideas are good, and other countries have already figured out that not only are they the right ideas, but they work. It's because the right's ideas only need to spread a little for them to be, quote, effective and have an impact, where the ideas of the left often require, because they are progressive, egalitarian ideas, the ideas of the left often require institutional support and legislation and much more infrastructure. And I hate to admit this, but if we don't accept this and understand it, we will never win, okay? So again, context, just to remind everybody, today we are talking so much about the shootings that took place and related issues. We are going to get fully demonetized for covering these issues. Now, if we were weaker, what we would do is just pick stories for today that would be monetized. But these issues are so important that we are just doing an entire show that will be demonetized on YouTube. Please help us out with that. Support us directly, ideally with a membership at joinpakman.com. Any discussions of gun safety or whatever else after an incident are always demonetized by YouTube. So we have these shootings, and then immediately the pro-gun movement goes into effect. Any discussions about gun safety after a shooting are called politicized by the pro-gun right. This isn't the right time to talk about those things. And then if we wait a little while and they say, and then we say, let's talk about them now, now that we're not right after a tragedy, let's do some of this gun safety stuff. Then they say, we don't even have a problem. When was the last mass shooting that we had? And usually it's only like a couple of weeks, but it doesn't matter. That's their argument. And one of the ideas that we have sort of lost on is the idea that guns shouldn't be seen as a way to solve problems. There's the debate, which I will talk about in a second, about specific gun safety regulations. But the left has lost a bigger culture fight. This country has a sickness, which is that too many people see guns as a way to solve their personal problems. They see guns as a way to solve societal problems. They see guns as a way to solve cultural and economic problems. We will not win until we root out that malignancy. And in the meantime, we're not even going to reduce the mass shootings until we make it more difficult to carry out some of these ideas by making the guns more difficult to come by. And this is where we have to understand that even just within gun safety, there are such simple things that we just can't get done because ultimately there isn't enough overwhelming support for them where it matters. Universal background checks, okay? We couldn't pass universal background checks after the Sandy Hook shooting with Democrats controlling the White House, the House, and the Senate. If we can't do it then, I don't know that we can ever do it without some wholesale realignment of American culture, period. Stricter mental health or psych evals for all gun sales with restrictions based on outcomes. Depending on the outcome of those psych evals, restrictions on firearm ownership that are stricter and apply to all gun sales, period. We just can't do it. Focusing bans on certain ammunition types and modifications that make it even harder for law enforcement to subdue a shooter before they, or really when we talk about shooters, we're talking about before he can do more damage. Our takeaways have to be, the goal must be the total destruction of the political movement known as modern republicanism, which now includes Trumpism. Because we can talk about bipartisanship. We can listen to some of the Democratic candidates, talk about how they are going to get things done with Republicans. We will make no progress while these people control the White House or the Senate or the House of Representatives. This is not, by the way, a pat on the back to Democrats. We still won't get a ton of stuff if Democrats are in power, but we might get some basic things, some gun safety, some more funding and access to mental health treatment. But now we on the left need to look at ourselves as well as the platforms that we're on. Okay, this is a responsibility thing as well. If you look at the manifesto of the El Paso shooter, and you consider that he posted something to the radical right message board 8chan before the shooting, you come to realize something. Those calls I get from young people who say, hey, I was radicalized by the right-wing online echo chamber, but then I found the David Pakman show, and then I found Kyle Kulinski, and I found others, and it's so great, you guys de-radicalized me. That is great. But just as it was merely by chance that some of my audience was de-radicalized because they stumbled upon my videos or Kyle's or Sam Cedars or someone else's, those same people, once they were in the rabbit hole, could have just as easily been brought even further down the other side and been pushed from being alt-righters who were not willing to do actual violence. They could have been pushed into the people that do actual violence and ultimately end up in the news the way that shooters over the weekend have. So what I'm saying is there are so many people in society right now whose ideology is so malleable. I mean, it's like putty, that merely by chance, by algorithmic coincidence, it could be they go from Ben Shapiro to Stefan Molyneux and off to the right and committing violence in the real world. Or they could just by that same possibility of algorithmic echo chambers go from Ben Shapiro to David Pakman to Kyle Kulinski, and that could actually be the difference between someone committing real world violence or not. And I'm not saying that this is now, it's David Pakman and Kyle Kulinski who will be the undoing of violence in society. That's not what I mean. What I'm pointing out is in the same way that by chance some people get de-radicalized by these online echo chambers and algorithms, totally beyond our control, some will just as easily be radicalized into violence. I'm always careful not to say any two extremists are the same, or that anything is like the Nazis, or that anyone is Hitler. But we also have to look really specifically at pre-World War II Germany in the 20s and 30s and the current circumstances in the United States. There are too many similarities to ignore. That doesn't mean another Holocaust is coming. But what we need to understand is when we talk about fascism and authoritarianism, there are too many similarities here that are more evidence that we are losing in a great way on the left. The use of the propaganda technique of repeating lies until people believe them. Trump relies on this and it works, and we are losing around it. We are merely playing catch up around it. Hitler, like Trump, was sort of like an ignorant, uneducated showman who lacked a lot of basic knowledge about the world, but pulled people in with catchphrases and simple ideas because he at least had a sense of what got people's attention. That's very similar to Donald Trump. Similarly, Anti-internationalism was a big thing in post-World War I Germany, which mixes with isolationism. Germany had this in that period before World War II. We are seeing it again in the US in Trump with the idea of separating from Europe and our allies, building walls, keeping brown people out, protectionism on trade. We are seeing that as well. Self-victimization. Trump is the victim of everybody, right? The Democratic Party trumps the victim. Journalists trumps the victim. The fake news media trumps the victim. Everyone is victimizing Trump the way German propaganda claimed that Germany was being victimized in the period before World War II. And we can't ignore what we're talking about here in the context of these mass shootings. In the same way that we saw it in pre-World War II Germany, Donald Trump is using the thinly veiled promotion of violence through these coded messages and the suggestive vocabulary he uses. This is another similarity. So we on the left need a full accounting and plan here, because this needs to stop. But we're only going to start being able to do that if we first recognize that, yes, we're losing the battle of ideas because they win much more easily than we do. Example. We want health care for all. We want to reduce income inequality. We want to stop pointless wars. We want to totally take apart the military-industrial complex. How do we do that? Well, we've got to be activists for that, for years, working to change public opinion such that we will elect people who will ultimately do those things. But the other side just needs some radical nuts to, on the same weekend, go and open fire because they hate immigrants, and it's a win for them. So when I say we're losing the battle, I don't mean we have the wrong ideas. I don't mean we aren't communicating them effectively, even though we could probably communicate them in a better way. What I mean is that the threshold for winning is so much lower for them, and I don't know how we fight that. So that's where my commentary ends. I would love to at this point say, and then here is what we do. Unfortunately, I don't know what we do. And I want to hear from you about it. We will have a poll about this on our Instagram page at David Pakman Show. Follow me on Instagram while you're there at david.pakman. It will be a very long week of trying to sort out a lot of this, and I'm glad that you'll be here with me in order to do that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So once it became clear that the El Paso shooter was a right-winger radicalized by many of the same ideas that have been fomented by this administration, leaving a right-wing manifesto, Republicans had to rally around something else, some other talking point. And the talking point they chose basically was video games. We've got to do something about video games, with some vague mentions of social media in the background for credibility's sake, I guess. And we're going to get into some of these examples. Now, just a reminder, this video is going to be demonetized on YouTube. Almost all of today's show will be demonetized on YouTube because it's a show about shootings, terrorism, radicalization, important stuff. I've spoke to some other shows. Some people are choosing not to cover this in order to retain monetization. We've got to cover this stuff, okay? So I'm asking you, leave us a tip today. Become a member at joinpakman.com to help out with the fact that today's show is going to be a freebie in the sense of a no revenue show. So they bring out this tired trope of video games cause people to become radicalized and violent and go out and act out all of that violence in the real world. Here's just one short example from Fox News.
Bernard, what about video games? So many of these school shooters and others have been sort of raised on a diet of violent video games.
Now, this has been studied. Video games may cause already violent people or people predisposed to violence to go out into the world in some cases and commit a real world act of violence that they've already been predisposed to and potentially have even been thinking about. But video games, by and large, are not causing violence in otherwise nonviolent people. They will not indoctrinate perfectly reasonable people into the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, white nationalist delusions of the El Paso shooter. And this came up again when Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick went on Fox News. Take a look at this.
And I look at this evil act, and let's condemn it for what it is. Evil. And And I say, how long are we going to let, for example, and ignore at the federal level particularly, where they can do something about the video game industry? You know, in this manifesto that we believe is from the shooter, this manifesto, he talks about living out his super soldier fantasy on Call of Duty.
Another Republican, Kevin McCarthy, also on the video game talking point bandwagon. And sometimes they try to temper it a little bit by talking about social media, which does present a whole slate of issues societally, but that really shouldn't be mixed in with this video game talking point. Take a look.
But what are your thoughts on that in terms of understanding that words matter and that when we're talking to each other on social media or looking at video games where they're using videos of characters with these weapons, is there a conversation to be had about that, about the tone that this country is using? It's become commonplace to say whatever you want to anybody on social media.
I think we should, and you want to see from these individuals what they wrote in others, but I mean, this may be a place that we could find this ahead of time. There may be a place of what's being written can be changed, could be an indication that an individual needs help in others that we can stop. But the idea of these video games to dehumanize individuals, to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others. We've watched from studies shown before of what it does to individuals. When you look at these photos of how it took place, you can see the actions within video games and others. But what I'd like to do is make sure just get all the facts.
So we don't have to pretend that violence in movies and video games has no effect on anyone culturally in any way. But the El Paso shooter is a guy radicalized around specific radical right-wing ideologies. People who play video games and aren't radicalized by the stuff that Trump has been spewing aren't going to go out and commit violence like this. I did a Twitch stream last night. By the way, you should be following me there, twitch.tv/David Pakman. And people asked me, do I play video games? And I said, I don't play very many video games, but the one that I've been playing since I was quite young are the different iterations of Grand Theft Auto, one of the most violent games that is out there. And there's absolutely no connection whatsoever between the cartoonish violence in the game and anything that I've ever even considered doing in the real world. And importantly, other countries have video games. Look at Japan and look at the fact that there are basically no shootings in Japan. Every country has racist people. Every country has atheists for those who want to blame the fact that, God is no longer in school. Every country has mental illness. Other countries don't have the problems that we have, even though they have lots of these other ancillary characteristics. And there are also more general crime statistics to consider. Remember that video game playing in the United States has gone up for decades. Violence in total has also been going down for decades. The general trend is video games up, violence down. So we have to look at the nitty-gritty and the particulars of the types of shootings that we're actually having. And again, just as importantly, by proportion, there is just as much video gaming in other countries, and those countries don't have our mass shooting problems. This same guy, Dan Patrick, the Texas lieutenant governor, went on another Fox News show and said, we've got to really be careful about Antifa. Antifa's got to stay away, as if that has anything to do whatsoever with this shooting.
And again, law enforcement did an amazing thing. It just did an amazing thing. As your guest, I just heard a little bit of your previous guest talking about the crime scene, and when there's one or two people shot, you can imagine the size of this crime scene, and this will be an investigation that will take some time. I was looking at a story recently. I just saw in the last couple of days where Antifa is posting. They want to come to El Paso and do a 10-day siege. Clear message to Antifa: stay out of El Paso. Stay out of Texas, basically. But we don't need them coming in on September 1st. We didn't need them to begin with before this happened. But I would say to Antifa, scratch Texas off your map and don't come in. It is not the time and place for them to come at any time, but particularly in the aftermath of what's just happening in El Paso. So Antifa, message from the Lieutenant Governor: stay out of Texas.
Now, I've never defended Antifa or any political violence, but the idea of saying, given that a guy just mass shot and killed 20 people and injured many more on the basis of this right-wing anti-immigrant, xenophobic, white nationalist ideology, now I should also mention we don't need Antifa here. as if there's some kind of equivalency between the two groups. And of course, in the background of every single one of these clips, what's the elephant in the room? It's never guns. And that's likely the motivation for the fact that so many Republicans are jumping on the video game talking point. It's never guns, and that we shouldn't talk about. But it's also never right-wing radicalization either. That also not coming up. It's video games, and we've got to be careful about Antifa. And next, we literally have the juxtaposition of interrupting right-wing radicalization to report on a right-wing shooting, and of course, never mentioning that the shooter actually left a right-wing manifesto. Let's talk about that next. I want to call this next clip ironic, but it's so disgusting that maybe I'll call it tragically ironic. Fox News had to literally interrupt its own fear-mongering about Hispanic immigrants at the U.S. border in El Paso, Texas, to cut to breaking news that an anti-immigrant extremist went to the border in El Paso and shot people because he believes Hispanic immigrants are taking over the country. The exact thing that Fox News was fear-mongering about when they broke into their own coverage. And before we get into this, just to be like crystal clear, I know I've mentioned this story will be demonetized by YouTube. We will earn no money on this one, but we consider this obviously so important that we have to cover it. So please consider supporting us directly at joinpacman.com. Share the video, like the video, comment on the video. That's all really important, even if we don't make any money from this story. Let's look at the video. Fox News spent their entire morning on Saturday scaring people with the number of illegals expected to cross, all of this other stuff, then a story about drug smuggling at the border. And then right in the middle of a report, here we go, literally going to their reporter who happens to already be in El Paso to fearmonger about the border. And then they go to a report of the shooting that has taken place. Take a look.
This crisis on the border likely not going to be over anytime soon, at least from a congressional standpoint. Several Democratic lawmakers told me that there is almost no chance of Congress tackling the loopholes in our immigration system before the next election, meaning this crisis, more than 100,000 people crossing the border each of the last 4 months now, is going to continue for at least another year and a half, if not more. Jillian?
Garrett, thanks for that. We're going to know now to a Fox News alert. We're getting word of an active shooter situation in El Paso, Texas. Residents there are being warned to stay clear of the Cielo Vista Mall area, with police officials saying the scene is still active.
Can it be any more direct than this? Fox News had to briefly interrupt their fear-mongering over Hispanic immigrants and, quote, illegals to report that someone radicalized by fear-mongering about Hispanic immigrants and, quote, illegals went to the border and killed 20 people. A border town, I understand. He wasn't literally at the border in El Paso, which is where a lot of this is happening. And then, as I've already told you, went directly back into the fear-mongering, did Fox News, about how video games may actually be the cause we need to be looking at for this shooting. I actually did something this weekend I never do. My curiosity got the best of me. I turned on Fox News to see their coverage of the shooting. I watched about 20 minutes. The 20 minutes I watched were hours after the shooter's right-wing manifesto had been found and published. We knew the right-wing radicalization and motivation of the shooter. And in those 20 minutes were all about the shooting that I watched on Fox News. They didn't mention the ideology or the motivations of the shooter once. They said he had a manifesto. They claimed that they weren't going to say what was in it in the same way that they're not going to say the shooter's name. And of course, these two things are very different. You might have noticed, you maybe didn't, I haven't mentioned any of the shooters' names from this weekend in this entire show. But I've told you plenty about their political background and their radicalization and their backgrounds. It is not the same thing as not mentioning the name. And also, I actually don't know, does Fox News not say the name of Islamic shooters? I genuinely don't know the answer to that. So we've got to stop funding Fox News, okay? We've got to cut the cord and support programs you like. A lot of people don't realize this, but when you have a cable TV subscription, a piece of that goes to Fox News. According to a report in Variety, Fox News makes $1.55 per cable subscriber, okay? Imagine how many of you could cut your cable, figure out what you want to watch and get that directly. There are ways to get your news channels, or if you want content that's on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever the case may be, and put that $1.55 that you're currently putting towards Fox News towards a show you like. It could be the David Pakman Show. It could be a different one. do the numbers. We have 710,000 YouTube subscribers. We have a growing following on Twitch. We have 200 radio and TV stations. Imagine if just 10% of our audience cut their cable, sent us $1.55 a month, and then put the rest towards other shows that they find valuable, that they like. Imagine how strong independent progressive media would be if we were to do that. We will take a quick break. Make sure you are following me on Instagram at david.pacman and follow the show on Twitch at twitch.tv/davidpacman. If you have Amazon Prime, you can subscribe to us on Twitch with Twitch Prime. It costs you nothing. It counts as a paid subscription for us, a fantastic way to support the work that we're doing.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
All right, let's have a conversation about economics here. One of the stories that Donald Trump has been telling us is that the economy would be way better off if the Federal Reserve would sort of help him out with a federal funds rate decrease the way that they've helped previous presidents. And Donald Trump has been talking about this for several years. Now, the truth is that both increases and decreases to the federal funds rate can help out a president in different ways, because the logic is that when you cut the federal funds rate, it makes it cheaper for banks to borrow money, which stimulates economic activity, which will then boost the stock market. But it also increasingly signals when you do an increase, I guess is what I'm trying to say, it signals that the Fed sees the economy as strong enough to tolerate an increase, which can also be liked by traders. So there are some economic reasons why it is said, or at least historically has been said, that decreases to the federal funds rate stimulate certain types of economic spending. But at the same time, increases in the federal funds rate are meant to signal strength by the Fed in their opinion of the economy, which can get people also buying up stocks and running up the price of the stock market. So the point is, either way, there is a mechanism for which a federal funds rate move can help the economy in the sort of superficial ways that presidents pay attention to. So in any case, Donald Trump finally got himself a federal funds rate decrease on August 1st, and stocks crashed. Looking at the Dow Jones, you'll see that upon the Fed's announcement of the rate cut, stocks were down about 3%. At the time of this filming today, intraday, the Dow is down almost 600 additional points. And there are three things that I want to talk about here. Trump's response to this, rate cuts more generally as mechanisms for influencing the economy, and then what is really the most important thing here, which is Donald Trump's tariffs. So let's start with the first issue. Donald Trump, after begging for rate cuts and getting one, and it not boosting stocks, and in fact coinciding with a decrease, came out and said, well, okay, the reason that this rate cut didn't work the way I expected was while the Fed did do a rate cut, they didn't do a bigger rate cut, which is what I really wanted. And they also didn't pair the rate cut with a statement that they're going to continue doing further cuts. So they're just not sending a clear enough signal about how great the economy is and is going to be. So we don't really need to talk much more about that. It's Trump logic, which is also known as anti-logic. I mean, it truly makes no sense whatsoever. And it is one of these things of Donald Trump post facto coming up with rationalizations that nothing beyond a 5-year-old or a hyper-partisan Republican would fall for. So then we get to, more generally, do rate cuts actually stimulate the economy? And there's a really interesting article in the New York Times, which says that lately, no, rate cuts don't really help anymore in the modern economy. The normal sort of mechanism is you cut the federal funds rate, and this will lead to Americans buying more durable goods like cars and such. It will drop interest rates on mortgages, so people will start refinancing their homes. They will lower their payments and have more money freed up to spend on other stuff. So it's great for the economy in that way. There are some other mechanisms, but for the consumer-facing analysis, that's the primary analysis. But there's a different modern economy now that we're in. The reality is the modern economy doesn't really work this way. People don't just save And then when there's a rate cut, go out and do a ton of spending. Spending has a much more sort of natural cycle. And then in addition to that, remember, the bottom 50% of the economy has stagnant wages. They've had stagnant wages for decades. They just can't afford to do much more buying because the Fed funds rate went down 25 basis points. So primarily, it is a method that ties into big finance and the run up of stock markets, which again only benefit a certain portion of the economy. Low rates won't do much if people don't have money. So the long and short of it is that even this reliance on rate cuts to jumpstart economies or to prevent recessions, that's old economic thinking. And of course, it's based on an economic status quo that was never good for most people anyway, of indefinite growth as the goal and such a sort of divergence between the benefits to the top 1% and 10% and 50% and almost nothing for the bottom 50%. So that's a bigger conversation to be had. But then here's the real elephant in the room, completely missing from Trump getting his rate cut and stocks crashing, Trump furious that a 25 basis point rate cut didn't jumpstart the stock market. Consider that the same day that the the funds rate was cut, Trump announced even more destructive tariffs, which are terrible for the United States. Take a look at this. Trump on Twitter, our representatives have just returned from China, where they had constructive talks having to do with the future trade deal. We thought we had a deal with China 3 months ago, but sadly, China decided to renegotiate the deal prior to signing. More recently, China agreed to buy agricultural products from the U.S. in large quantities, but did not do so. Additionally, my friend President Xi said that he would stop the sale of fentanyl to the United States. This never happened, and Americans continue to die. Trade talks are continuing, and during the talks, the U.S. will start on September 1st, putting a small additional tariff of 10% on the remaining $300 billion of goods and products coming from China into our country. This does not include the $250 billion already tariffed at 25%. So the entire conversation all along, Trump so reliant on the federal funds rate, which increasingly does not generate the economic reaction that it once used to or was believed to. Trump talking about the rate decrease wasn't big enough. The messaging from the Fed wasn't strong enough about how great the economy is and that there will be subsequent rate cuts. That entire discussion was a farce. Trump wanted a rate cut and he got it, and stocks crashed. Well, the problem is not that the cut wasn't big enough. The New York Times explains the rate cuts in general are less connected to immediate stock market gains, but nowhere in that entire back and forth is the reality that the same day that Trump announced more tariffs that are terrible for American companies and Americans at large, the stock market started to crash and is down as of right now. Might be different by the time it closes. We're filming before the close of the stock market today. The Dow is down an additional nearly 600 points. As usual, Donald Trump's propagandizing combined with a just very poor understanding of basic economics and the totally missing story of the tariffs ends up with completely wrong headlines related to what's happening in our economy. And of course, people fall for it and they say, yes, the problem is what Trump says. The problem is not stagnant wages for 40 years. It's that liberal, lefty biased Federal Reserve that just won't give Donald Trump a bigger rate cut. Trump is the victim, as usual. One of the things that Trump has in common with many other authoritarians, regularly framing himself as the victim. I will be talking much more about this, actually. Wednesday evening, I will be having a live stream on Twitch at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. We will be talking about this and many other economic issues. Follow me there, twitch.tv/David Pakman, and join me Wednesday evening, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Okay, big breaking news from the second Democratic debate that was held in the middle of last week. And the big breaking news is basically the debate has had no impact whatsoever on polling. Okay, barely anything has moved. We now have 2 post-debate polls, and I'll show you the data in a second. Just as a reminder, my analysis of the second Democratic debate was that in night 1, it was the Bernie-Warren progressive duo that really won the night. Either of them could be said to have won. I think they both did well. Some people in my audience saying it was Bernie who did better than Warren. Some saying the opposite, it was Warren who did better than Bernie. Otherwise, the performances were so poor that I actually had Marianne Williamson in 3rd place in night 1 of the debate. Night 2, I believe Andrew Yang stood out, And then I believe that actually Joe Biden did well, not because he said anything particularly great, but because he just weathered constant attacks from all of the other candidates. Other candidates coming in, or most of them anyway, clearly with the agenda of going after Biden. It made Biden, particularly as some of those attacks fell flat, it made Biden sort of seem like the calm, rational guy. His politics are to my right. I disagree with him on much policy, but I did think that he came away solid in that debate. We now have polling from after this second debate, and we will put up on the screen for you the polling before debate 1, the polling before debate 2, and now the post-debate 2 polling, which are numbers based on 2 post-debate polls, one from Harvard-Harris, one from Politico Morning Consult averaged. And what you will notice, the changes are Biden up slightly, Bernie up the most, Warren down, interestingly, Kamala Harris slightly down, everybody else basically unchanged. The zeros and ones still at 0 and 1. No real movement for Andrew Yang, technically actually down a bit, all still within the margin of error. So continuing to see absolutely no real effect for the zeros and ones from participating in these debates. Many of them are not going to make it to the third debate on September 12th. And my expectation is that at least some of them are going to end their campaigns once they can't participate in the debates. It is difficult to really justify continuing in the race unless they think, well, I could keep raising money one way or the other. So what's important to understand now is that historically at this point, most often the leaders in primary polling become the nominees, but not always. Okay, it could change this year, but historically, recently, that's the way it's been. Let's take a look at that. You will remember that. So what we're looking at, this is a November 2020 election, and we're in August of 2019. So we want to look at the equivalent time about 13, 14 months before prior elections. In 2016, Donald Trump was leading the Republican primary in August of 2015, and he ultimately was the nominee. Hillary Clinton was leading the Democratic primary in August of 2015, and she ultimately became the nominee. In 2012, Mitt Romney was ahead at this point in that Republican primary. He ultimately was also the nominee. Now, some counterpoints are that in 2008, you had Hillary Clinton winning primary polling at this point in the primary, and she ultimately lost, of course, to Barack Obama. And Rudy Giuliani was also leading the Republican primary in 2008 and ultimately lost to John McCain. So I'm not necessarily the bearer of good or bad news here. What I'm communicating is that recently, typically, the leaders in the primary polling right now end up being the nominees. But we have some examples from the last it was 11 years ago, but still 12 years ago at this point. Sometimes they don't. What I think is abundantly clear is that there is not a path that I see for anyone other than Biden, Bernie, Warren, maybe Harris, possibly Pete Buttigieg if he can turn it around. But I don't think anyone below Buttigieg right now has any shot at being the nominee. If you disagree with me, if you see a way that someone below the Buttigieg level right now could become the Democratic nominee, I want to hear from you. And don't just say, well, the polling could turn around and they could take the lead, because historically that doesn't happen with people polling, under 5% at this point in time. But tell me exactly what it is that's going to happen, particularly if they don't even make it to the debates that are in just 5 weeks. I want to hear from you. Let me know, maybe via Twitter at @dpacman. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2DavidP. We are getting more and more people who are contacting me saying, David, I know I was a YouTube subscriber and YouTube has unsubscribed me. There is some poor connection that takes place during this voicemail, but that's the point that this caller is trying to make. Take a listen.
Hey, David. My name is Jeremy, a longtime listener and longtime subscriber. I just wanted to let you know that I was watching your show last night. Everything was going fine on my end this
Good.
morning. Apparently, I have been unsubscribed from. It's not all in our collective heads. It is actually happening. I do not know and I will not point fingers at if it is malicious or just a bug, but it just happened to be. So thank you. Keep up the good work, and have a great day.
Yeah, so listen, here's the update. I've communicated that this is going on to YouTube probably 20 or 25 times at this point. They finally acknowledged that this is something that they've been hearing, but they are claiming, number one, that it is a glitch. But here's the really interesting thing, and this part doesn't make sense to me. YouTube has said when a glitch shows the button as enabled again that lets you subscribe. When you're subscribed, you can't subscribe again. The button is different. When you see the button that says subscribe, most people would assume I'm not actually subscribed. YouTube is claiming that the glitch shows the button as allowing them to subscribe again, but that in reality, YouTube still considers those users subscribed. They should still see our videos in their home feed. That's the problem that I'm having, because the viewers that are contacting me saying I was unsubscribed are even noticing that because they stop seeing our videos in their feed. They stop getting the email notifications for our videos. So I don't know what the truth is. I don't think it's malicious. I think that it is clearly something that's going on in the YouTube system that they've been either unable or unwilling to really drill down and figure out what's going on. And the explanation that it is only a glitch in the button does not strike me as the right explanation, because too many people are saying the reason I looked into whether I was subscribed or unsubscribed from your channel is that I was no longer getting your videos in my home feed at all. I don't know. Keep telling me what your experience has been, if this has happened to you. We've got a great bonus show for you today. The Trump administration is considering unveiling a new healthcare plan in September. The timing of that is relevant. The contents of the plan will, of course, be very, very relevant. We will discuss that. Trust in scientists is rising, according to a new poll. I believe that this is a good thing. There are people who don't. We are going to talk about that on today's bonus show. And we will also talk about Neil deGrasse Tyson being slammed for an insensitive and asinine tweet following some of the events of this weekend. I won't say what events, just to maybe try to get this video not to be demonetized on YouTube, but some of the events of this weekend caused Neil deGrasse Tyson to tweet, and he has been criticized for those tweets as they being insensitive and asinine. 2 ways to get access to this great bonus show that I'm describing. Become a member at www.joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I look forward to speaking to you on the bonus show or otherwise on tomorrow's new broadcast program.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.